Welcome to the Immanuel Network podcast. My name is Ryan Fullerton. I'm the lead pastor of Immanuel Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky.
And I'm Matthew Delaughter, pastor of Immanuel Community Church in New Orleans.
The Immanuel Network exists to help pastors plant and cultivate healthy churches for a global harvest. And this podcast is one resource to help pastors and their people accomplish this goal. Renn is our guest today. He's a writer and consultant in Indianapolis, Indiana. Aaron's work came to the forefront of my attention with his Three Worlds of Evangelicalism thesis, first published as articles and now in the form of his book, Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in and Anti-Christian Culture. His writing has appeared in numerous outlets, including The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, First Things. In addition to his writing, he's also a senior fellow at American Reformer, which he co-founded. Aaron Renn is also well known for his fascination with city planning, which I think you guys were just talking about, and his discussion of the lack of evangelical elites. Aaron, thank you for joining the Immanuel Network podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Aaron, we're glad to have you. Like I was sharing before, have followed you for a couple of years now, just reading your newsletter. I think I've told a couple of people I really only have like 2 subscriptions. As one is a local Axios newsletter and yours that I follow. So just have always been thankful for your work. But we particularly today wanted to talk with you with something that recently came out in First Things called The Problem with the Evangelical Elite. And I mean, right in the first sentence, you identify what the problem is and that there is not one. Now, I think if some people maybe hear that, they may think of some evangelical people they know in culture and like want to object. And so they may think of Chick-fil-A or Hobby Lobby. But there you say that these are industries that present themselves as profitable, but as prosaic industries. We can maybe start right there. What do you mean there? What kind of distinction are you trying to make there early on in the article?
Well, obviously, that first sentence is sort of a play on Mark Knoll's Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, which he wrote 30 years ago. The scandal of the evangelical mind is that there isn't one. And that's kind of where I got that quip from. But basically, one of the things I talk about in the article is when you talk about who are the evangelical elites, and you ask that question, first off, everybody you talk to who's an evangelical is immediately going to start thinking about internal elites within evangelicalism. Pastors. Yeah. Al Mohler is an evangelical elite. Kevin DeYoung or Carl Trueman or John Piper or, even a megachurch pastor like a Stephen Furtick, big people, right? Like that. Yeah. That's the evangelical elites. And that dominates the discussion. Carl Trueman actually wrote a big essay for First Things, is pretty good, a few years ago about it may have been called something similar to The Problem of the Evangelical Elite, only that's who he was talking about.
Yep.
What I'm talking about is elites in the sort of outside world, outside of the church, in the key culture shaping domains of society, politics, business, media, entertainment, publishing, foundations, higher education, etc. And not just any of these, but the ones that have disproportionate influence over our society. You can think about being a U.S. senator, being at the New York Times, at Harvard, at Google, at Goldman Sachs, companies like that, the places and domains that really shape us. And the one that I think is the most obvious to understand is members of the Supreme Court. There is not a single evangelical on the Supreme Court. I believe there are 6 Catholics. Yep. And the evangelicals basically just don't run anything of importance in our society. That's only slightly an exaggeration. Again, there's no evangelicals who are presidents of a prestigious university, a prestigious foundation. There are a handful of evangelicals at major publications, not too many. Evangelicals don't even run conservative political think tanks and publications in Washington, D.C. Yeah. I actually did a survey one time and said, who runs these things? And there were only one of them that was an evangelical. Everybody else was Catholic, Jewish, or mainline Protestant. And the mainline Protestants basically are operating under deep cover. Like, it's very hard to figure out what their actual religious affiliation is. And so I did say there are 2 exceptions that prove the rule here: politics and business. There are a lot of evangelical successful politicians, tons of them. there are also a lot of successful people in evangelical business. But you get to this point, they tend to be in, again, what I call profitable but prosaic industries, low cultural leverage, meaning evangelicals make superb, businessmen. There's some really, really top shelf business talent in the evangelical world, but they're running restaurants like Chick-fil-A, firms like Hobby Lobby. Maybe it's an oil and gas company at best. They're not running, again, the examples I use, Google. Google determines what people see on the internet. We're not running companies like that. BlackRock. Think about BlackRock, big asset manager. The criterion they use for who to invest in causes companies to jump through hoops to meet it so that they'll buy them. We don't have anybody like it. We're not in the high finance area, and think about media. Think about Rupert Murdoch's media empire and how powerful that is in shaping things. We don't play in those spaces. And so, we have probably a quarter of America is evangelical, but we basically are all but absent from those key positions in society.
Yeah. So some contrast you'll make in this article will be between evangelicals and Catholics. You even just mentioned here the amount of Catholics that we'd have on the Supreme Court. One of them actually being from New Orleans, Amy Coney Barrett. But why do you think the imagination is different with evangelicals and Catholics when it comes to that, and who I'm going to be in life, or even how I would think of an elite? I think it's a good point you make when. If you ask an evangelical to name elites, you even provided an AI query here where I think 100% was returned. It was pastors. And with Catholics, it was only 20% of the names were anybody related to clergymen. The rest of them were in these other fields.
Right.
So, why is the imagination different there, do you think?
Yeah, well, there's a lot that could be said about that. I probably very complex, and I don't want to suggest I have the entire code cracked on it. But one thing about Protestantism in America is that America being a Protestant country, its institutions mainstream institutions were very Protestant by default. So like Harvard, Princeton, and Yale were essentially Protestant institutions. Mm-hmm. That's one thing. Whereas with Catholics being kind of on the outside, they really had to build their own infrastructure to sustain sort of their own community life. So they had to build their parochial schools. They had to build their universities. They had to build fraternal societies like the Knights of Columbus. They created things like Opus Dei, which is based in Spain, but it's all over the country. So they have all these institutions that they had to build in order to sustain Catholic life in America. And what happened was the sort of self-consciously Protestant institutions like, say, Yale University were essentially emptied of their Protestant and religious content. And that kind of left a lot of those were the elite institutions of Protestantism, right? Yeah. And that left basically a lack of institutions for Protestants, whereas the Catholics kind of had their own infrastructure that was there. The second thing is that Protestantism in America was always very socioeconomically, ethnically, and even racially stratified, as we know. Okay. Yeah. So, there was sort of a socioeconomic pecking order with, Episcopalians at the top and, then Presbyterians, and then you move down to like Methodists and Baptists, which were kind of like not the highest in the country. Yeah. So what you had was, and it used to be that as people, sort of like with General Motors cars, as you moved up in the world, you would move from a Chevy, to an Oldsmobile, to a Buick, to a Cadillac. Yeah. You would move from being a Methodist to being a Presbyterian. Then if you made it to the C-suite, maybe you'd become an Episcopalian. And so as you moved up in society, you sort of became essentially mainline Protestant. Mainline denominations were really where Protestant elites lived. And of course, the mainline denominations, they sort of, a lot of them kind of abandoned what you might call traditional theology 100 years ago. Yeah. But really, for a long time, I don't think people appreciate that, like, liberal Protestantism was like a living, dynamic belief system for a very long time. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was really an animated way. Like the social gospel right? People really thought they were applying Christian principles to society. So it may not have been, inerrancy or whatever, but it was still Christianity as a living, breathing force. And that sort of died out, at some point. And then, in the 60s, mainline started going into decline. They were never able to turn it around. And so ultimately, there is no more escalator taking you to, the Episcopal Church when you're a Supreme Court justice. Although, Neil Gorsuch is an Episcopalian, although my understanding is he actually converted from Catholicism, I think, because his wife was an Episcopalian and all that.
Oh, okay.
But they're just, and to the extent that there actually are Protestant elites in America, a lot of them are Episcopalian. They just don't talk about it.
Okay.
And, so it's sort of like we're putting our lamp under a bushel there. And so I think as a result of our institutions, like our key institutions being essentially de-Christianized, like Harvard, Princeton, Yale, as a result of the decline of the mainline denominations, there's no longer a kind of a functional, you can think of it as a funnel, like taking you into these positions, or, kind of the escalator. So now as you move up in the world, you do one of two things. You either become secular, you abandon religion, or you become sort of a, post-Protestant, if you will, or you become Roman Catholic. And I think J.D. Vance is the best example of that. So in essence, evangelicalism represented sort of the middle class of Protestantism. And so it's vibrant, it's alive, it's populist, it's faithful, it's energetic in terms of mission, in terms of like volunteering at the county jail, at the homeless shelters, at the, the food pantries. There's so much good stuff being done, but our sort of like top stratum got chopped off, and it's sort of like, we never figured out how to regenerate that. So in essence, evangelicalism was always sort of a middle class phenomenon, not an elite phenomenon.
Yeah.
And we lost the elites.
That ecclesial ethos, I was even thinking about, and I don't know how much of it's chicken and the egg, because even as I was thinking about whether you're Episcopalian or Catholic, you have like, even if you're thinking about polity, you got this Episcopal model, and we're Baptists, so that's, in contrast to something that's congregational. So in an Episcopal model, it's almost like you don't mind even within the church viewing someone with this higher status than you, but like, I feel like in Baptist churches or like evangelical, everyone's like, well, he's a pastor, but he's just one of us.
He's just brother.
Yeah, he's just brother.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I grew up in rural Assemblies of God church. It had a lot of that. A lot of the old elites were Congregationalists in New England. So there was a sort of Calvinistic Congregationalism that sort of was, in New England that was a more, I guess the word is hierarchical view of society, and their view of calling and election. Yeah. When we talk about like a lot of Reformed people today, sort of election is entirely about soteriology, who is elected to salvation. Whereas it would have had a more robust sense of, I have sort of been elected by God to this leadership position, and therefore I am kind of entitled and expected to use it and to give an account for it. And of course, you can read Weber and all these accounts, and, the Lutheran account, sort of like, well, you're called to your station in society, so you should be content where you are. Whereas the Calvinists were much more like, well, we need to really make our election sure, as it says in the Bible, and therefore we have to really work hard to produce results that show. And so we get that sort of animating spirit there. But I mean, evangelicalism, Baptist, it's very democratic, you know, and, just like the annual Southern Baptist convention. I don't know what you call it when you have your annual meeting, but like, it's like a big democratic Robert's Rules thing. Everybody's going up to the mic. You can speak, all this stuff. And it's very democratic, very populist in a lot of ways. And part of that, one of the reasons that America became so Methodist and so Baptist was because of the use of non-credentialed ministers, basically, too. It's like, you wanted to be a Presbyterian minister, you need to go to college for 4 years, and you had to go study in Germany, and you had to do all this stuff. And like, in a growing country, there's just no way to, serve this growing nation with that kind of an approach. And the Baptists and the Methodists were really able to they were sort of able to like commission workers to go into the field. And I'm not as up on as I should be on the Methodist governance, which is, I think, actually very hierarchical.
Yeah, it is.
Original Methodist.
I grew up Methodist. It's Episcopal model. Yeah.
But I think the idea was we need some hierarchy to keep an eye on all these circuit riding, all these guys who are out there like in the field doing things. We need some hierarchy to make sure they don't go off the rails. But so they had a structure around it, but it was very democratic. It's like, we don't need all these sort of, credentialed experts. We don't need that. And so, again, it's very populist. It's democratic. It's egalitarian. And there's a lot of good things that come out of that. And our nation, that in a sense reflects an authentic part of the American tradition going back a long way. It's a really authentic part of our national culture, but there are other parts of our national culture too. You can think about the old WASP elites, blue bloods like FDR and these people who are sort of doing things. That's the kind of thing that we sort of are missing. We're missing that. It's like we've reduced ourselves to only like one gear. We used to have multiple gears in the gearbox, multiple tools in the tool chest. I don't know what it is, but we've sort of narrowed the range, in a sense.
But you don't think our evangelical ethos should prevent us from producing cultural elites?
Yeah. I think we have to look at it in terms of, I think about this a lot. I don't pretend to have all the answers. Here's one thing I would say though, and this is a source of debate. Should Christians be running key institutions in our society? And there's a lot of people who would say no. And they say it in many ways. Like, Jesus didn't come to acquire power. He came to give up power. Our kingdom is not of this world. We are exiles here. There's a lot of very Anabaptistic thinking into that, and which is essentially kind of illegitimate to say that you should want to be in charge of something or you should aspire to be in charge. Whereas I think, I think it's different. I think the Bible, if you aspire to be an overseer, that's a good thing. I think that kind of ambition is good, but you have to make these qualifications. Here, you want to be that. Here's what you got to live up to if you want to be that. Or you should desire the gift of prophecy. You want the greater gifts. Earnestly desire the greater gifts. So I feel like there is some things that, like, even in New Testament context are there. And also the apostles said, we shouldn't be handing out lunch to widows. We need to get some people to take care of that because that's important. We need to devote ourselves to prayer and preaching the word. So there are these things here. But the key is, if you don't have people in these positions who are Christian, then who's going to be running them? People who aren't Christian. And so if you want to live in a society that's run by people who don't share your values, then you don't need to be up to, there's that. So I think we have to, we do want people, I think, in those positions, if they are in fact qualified to lead. I don't think simply being, a kind of call it an elder qualified Christian necessarily equips you to be a Supreme Court justice. That requires competence in that domain as well. So you have to have both. But there's that. And so, but on the other hand, what I want to say is, I don't think, by definition, elites are numerically small. And the fact is, evangelical culture is what it is. And we shouldn't go to, some Methodist church or some Baptist church and tell them you need to change what you're doing in order to try to produce elites. That's probably not going to go over well. I think that's not going to go over well. Although I would say, if you're Southern Baptist, if you're in the South, there are towns where, First Baptist Church, it's like the mayor goes there, and it is kind of a mainline church in parts of the South. So it is sort of an elite church in a sense. Yeah. But I would say, what are there, 14 million people in the Southern Baptist Church and all these millions of non-denom people who are basically Baptists. Yeah. And, I attend a Baptist church, non-denom Baptist church. Even though I would say I'm kind of convictionally Presbyterian, I'm, going to I'm not that convictionally, I guess I wouldn't be there. But the point being, there are people coming up out of there that have talent and potentially have the ambition, and we just need to make sure we don't suppress them. And it's sort of like, my dad, when he was growing up, he was born in 1946, so he's 80 years old tomorrow. And he, when he graduated from high school, he went to the Marine Corps. He was in the Marine Corps for 4 years, came out, decided to go to college. He was going to enroll in the local, regional campus of Indiana University. And my grandfather told him, college? Why in the world would you want to go to college? Come down here to Louisville Cement Company where I work. I'll get you a job right now, making more money. What are you going to do when you come out of college? You're going to be a teacher. You're going to make like $4,000 a year. So you can make more than that right now. It's like, what are you doing? You're an idiot to go to college.
Yeah.
And so that thing, it's not even they were Catholic. This isn't even an evangelical thing. This is the cultural thing of that sort of populist thing. It is suppressive of ambition. It says, and there's a big streak of this, like in rural Indiana. So I'm from Indiana and rural Indiana, so I know this well. It's like, if you choose to do anything outside the norm, it is interpreted as you saying you're better than everybody else. Oh, yeah. You think you're better than us. You think you're too good for us, aren't you? It's like, and there may be cases where that's true, but we end up being incredibly suppressive and negative towards people who might say, I want to go to Harvard instead of to State U. Or we don't even put it on their radar that they should be thinking, like I was the highest performing student in the history of my school. I went to a small, like elementary and high schools in Southern Indiana. And I won an award as one of the top 40 high school students in the state of Indiana, the year I graduated. And I went to Indiana University and it worked out well for me, but like nobody ever like encouraged me, Aaron, you probably could go to Harvard. I could have gone to Harvard. Yeah. I wouldn't be getting into Harvard today, but back then I could have gone to Harvard, but like I didn't even know that. And so I think there's this idea is that like people have all this potential and maybe things that they might be interested in that they don't even know about, but they're sort of suppressed. And so that's what I think we need to do. I think we need to be careful not to be suppressive of our young people. And we want to open the aperture of their vision of like, help them to think bigger. And, I think we need to welcome people who might not fit. Often it's the people who don't fit in a lot of these environments who, might be interested in going off, especially in doing something creative. You want to be a writer or something like that, or you want to be these things. You're going to seem a little weird, and just like, again, we have an opportunity, obligation to help our kids be realistic and all this stuff too, but we don't want to squelch them with too much negativity. And I think that's something, and we create a culture that basically says it's illegitimate. It's bad, and you shouldn't be ambitious. You got to be more humble. Maybe you're having an idolatry of your career, an idolatry of this. All this talk about idolatry, I feel like it's kind of like one of its effects is to sort of, make you feel, create what I call the Buddhist mood. This idea is you shouldn't actually want anything all that much, because if you don't get it and you feel bad about it at all, it must indicate that it was idolatry. And so I feel like there's a lot of things like that.
Yeah.
And, so I think there's a lot going into that. I think we need to be like, we just need to create a path for not everybody, but there are people who just, with extraordinary talents.
Yeah.
And why wouldn't it be amazing if we could see them be like raised in a good Christian home, good Christian church, and get on the Supreme Court? I'd like to see them do both.
What do you think that evangelicals potentially bring to the table? I mean, what is, let's not assume that it's a good thing that evangelicals become elites. Let's spell out why. Why would it be good that evangelicals be elites? I mean, obviously, it's got to be something beyond just we want more of our people in the elite position. What is it you think? You allude to this in your article, but I'd love to hear you develop it. What do Protestants or evangelicals at their best, when they take their most talented, when the one who is excellent at his work winds up standing before kings, what does the evangelical who winds up standing before kings, if he's humble, godly, holy, what does he bring to the table?
Right. Well, I bet an evangelical wouldn't rule. I mean, again, I don't know who was on the Supreme Court at that time. Probably no evangelicals. They probably wouldn't rule that there's a First Amendment right to hardcore porn or something like that. I mean, it's just like some insane things like that. Like some of these rulings are just insane, and they just sort of make up their own jurisprudence as they see fit. And so I think, something that's animated more by, than a secular liberationist vision that is not necessarily rooted in any textual law or anything like that. I think we would have had very different legal environment. Now that doesn't mean it would all be good necessarily. There'd be some negatives that come out of that. But just look at how vice is completely dominating our society today with pot legalization and gambling legalization and OnlyFans porn and Hub and all these things. And, the other one, I always bring payday loan stores. Yeah. All these things, it's like predatory finance, vice, all of this stuff. I mean, Protestantism, if there's one thing Protestantism was good at, was suppressing vice. Maybe too good, you could say sometimes, and that made it a little too far. But I don't think the Southern Baptists would have been, promoting most of these things.
Yep.
And
no, that's excellent.
I think they would have been saying, well, maybe that's not good. And of course, those things are bad for society. They're bad for people. And there's a lot of things going on there. So I think those are the cases. The other thing is a lot of times you get this, a lot of these conservative elites. They're Catholic or they're very shaped by Catholic ideas. So you end up with weird, sort of weird things like Catholic integralism, those political theologies produced by Adrian Vermeule, who's a Catholic convert professor at Harvard Law School, or Catholic social teaching, which is not all bad, but we actually have our own ideas about that stuff in the Protestant tradition, including here in America through the progressive movement. And effectively Catholic social teaching kind of developed a little bit in parallel with the progressive movement and a lot there. And the progressive, and this is what I think, one thing evangelicals have done this, and frankly, kind of, the Catholics have done it too. They like this too, is anything good that happened in America has been de-Protestantized and is now viewed as purely American. This is just America. Whereas anything they don't like, Salem witch trials or prohibition, that's the Protestant stuff. When in fact, the reality is America was created by Protestants. But we've become complicit in that because we've said things like the progressive movement, of which you could think of sort of like muscular Christianity and social gospel and all that stuff in that era. Well, that was all liberal. So, we can't talk about that. But that's how we tamed modernity. It was Protestants who sort of tamed the industrial modernity. And oh, by the way, who built the United States of America and built the railroads and created the first industrial society and the middle class. And and again, it's we don't have to take 100% credit for it, but we actually did a lot of that stuff. And oh, by the way, one of the reasons that we can't respond, this is an argument I would make. One of the reasons that we cannot respond to new modern economic, cultural, other challenges is because we don't have a legitimate elite like the old WASP elite that knew how to do that stuff, right? We handed over the keys in essence to other people, and they haven't been able to drive the car very well.
So if you were
I think that's what I'd say.
Ron, what you gonna say? I have a question.
You go ahead, Matthew. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna ask. So Aaron, I remember when I was in either seminary or at Boyce College, we read "To Change the World" by James Davison Hunter. I think that's right. And I remember it really was, just a helpful book for me because I think what I wanted to do, I just wanted to go plant a church somewhere. And, obviously being influenced by, people that you've mentioned in your article, like Tim Keller, go to an urban area, plant ourselves there for, Lord willing, the rest of our lives. And kind of how I thought about culture changing there is it's a grassroots movement. And I think what that book does is it kind of turns that on its head and said, not exactly. But I'm thinking that way as someone who grew up I said I grew up, Methodist. I was in the mainline for a little bit, but I, pretty much, by that time in all evangelical circles, and I just think that's just how people typically think, is that, if you want to change the world, it's
Save
locally, and
souls.
save
Culture
souls,
changes one individual at a time.
yeah, and what he does in that book is he shows actually the importance for affecting culture from the top down. Do you think that's? I can have conversations with. I'm 40 now, and just I can talk with people who've like read him and heard these things, and they're more open to those ideas. But do you think that's still like a pervasive thought with evangelicals?
I think evangelicals think that the way you change the world is to change hearts through conversion and discipleship of individuals. And yes, and if you convert a sufficient quantity of people in a community, that will lead to a cultural transformation, which maybe it will. Now, I would have some nuances when it comes to Hunter. I do believe culture changes from the top down through networks of elites and connected via institutions at or near the cultural center, which is sort of what he said. But Jesus and the 12 apostles were sort of from the social margins, in essence. So what you have to do, you don't have to start in the center, but you kind of have to make it to the center, and you have to attract some elites, sort of the way that, Jesus was able to attract Joseph of Arimathea. Well, we got Paul on board. Paul was an elite. And so we attracted some elites. It wasn't created by the elite. And so I do think there's a sense in which you need the elites to kind of validate what you're doing, but it doesn't have to originate necessarily as an elite project. So I think there's a little nuance there. But yeah, that book, Hunter is brilliant. And I'm actually going to write a lengthy analysis of his idea from that book called Faithful Presence that I think correctly understood is a very powerful concept. But the way that it's been applied by evangelicals who went to places like New York City has really become a formula for saying, let's work hard, try to succeed in elite occupations and keep our head down and not cause any problems. Don't go do anything gauche like protest abortion. That's bad. The real way that you change culture is through becoming like, a partner in a law firm or something like that. And that's a little bit of an exaggeration. I'm going to go into more details, but I lived in Manhattan for several years. Yeah. And lived in Chicago for a very long time. And I think I have a good feeling on that. And I think it became sort of a recipe for be successful in the big city and kind of keep your head down and don't do anything that's going to get you in trouble. I think that's functionally how it was interpreted. So
how do we?
And that's a result, as a result, it became very passive and accommodating. And, Keller had a lot of influence on me, but I think if you read his book, which I mentioned in my article, if you read his book, Every Good Endeavor, which was his vocational theology, he gives 28 examples in the book, 28 illustrations, none of which involve anyone in a recognizably elite role using the core powers of their office to direct, structure, order, anything. One of the stories, I've used this example a lot because it really, I think, illustrates the thinking. One of his examples is this woman goes to work for a media company and makes a terrible mistake that might cost her job. But her boss takes the blame for her mistake and she gets to stay there. And she asks him, why did you take the blame for my mistake? And he says, well, I'm a Christian and somebody took the blame for me. And so that's it. And so then she asked him where he goes to church. He said Redeemer. She went to Redeemer and became a Christian. That idea of, that's the mentality I think that is inculcated there, is you want to essentially go into these places as it's like an evangelistic opportunity.
Yeah.
More than a shaping opportunity. It's an evangelistic opportunity. It's about being salt and light, such as in that situation. It's not about saying, well, man, we're going to restructure this movie studio to start doing some different things around here. And so I do think that the way that they've thought about that is very much a small ball vision, even for the people in New York, candidly.
I think a lot of times, though, what trips evangelicals up when it comes to trying to get to the top, and I think it was Keller who used this illustration, is sort of the idea that you've got to sleep with the director to get the starring role. in the play, and that basically that the way to the top, there's not really a way there without compromise. And by the time you get to the top, you're not the kind of person you ought to be to manage that kind of power. And so I would be curious what your thoughts are. I was thinking about, so I prepared for this interview, thinking about what are the ways people rise to the top in the scriptures, and it's amazing how many of them are miracles. It's amazing when you think about Joshua, when you think about Daniel, when you think about the way they got to the top. It wasn't exactly because they had a community that was encouraging elites. So how would you? I mean, obviously, we don't want to sin to get to the top. But if we do want to see some of our people at the top, what are the human ways we can think of that would really help encourage people get into those positions of influence that can really transform society for the good?
Yeah, well, I think one thing is, evangelicals don't even know how you make it to the top.
Mm-hmm.
So there's sort of like you can think of it as kind of 2 or 3 levels. Level 1 is we just don't even know, what's going on. And that's like most people. That was me in high school, where I didn't even know that it mattered where I went to college. Level 2 is what I call the striver level knowledge. Striver level knowledge is understanding kind of the written rules or the official story. What you want to do is you want to go to Harvard. And then when you go to Harvard, you get into you got to get a job with McKinsey, and there's that. And then to get into Harvard, here's all the tricks. You got to have these perfect SAT scores. You have to get all these AP classes. You have to create a nonprofit and do all this stuff and all that. And the answer is yes, there is a way to get sort of towards the top through the official story. But the reality is there's also, how does it really work? How do people really get to the top? That's like 3rd level. That's like next level knowledge. People who are elite, how do they truly operate? And of course, there's a lot of, now everybody talks a lot about Nepo babies and things like that. And there's a lot of stuff like that goes on, but it's not all nefarious. I think this idea that the only way to the top is through some sort of moral compromise is a kind of a story we like to tell ourselves as to why we're too pure to actually be in the game. And to just sort of point to those people and say, tisk, tisk, or he must have been a compromiser, and that there's something unsavory about even wanting to be in that world. Now, again, I don't know the Hollywood world all that well, but, I work for a, major conservative think tank. I've written for the New York Times. I was a managing director in a big consultancy, and I don't think there was any call on me to morally compromise in order to make those things happen. Now, I don't think that the members of our Supreme Court were doing shady things to get on the court. Because if they were, they would never have gotten on the court, because it would have come up in their confirmation hearing. And yes, of course, there's corrupt politicians and there's all this stuff. There is corruption. There is Harvey Weinsteins of the world and all that stuff. But the fact is, I don't think it is required that you be a reprobate behavior or morally compromise in order to do it. Now, that does mean what I say is one of the problems evangelicals have is they believe in sort of very moralistic politics as opposed to prudential politics and very moral. They're very moralistic about their approach to things, which makes it difficult to work and play well with others. And I think. And again, you guys are the pastors, so I'm going to give you my just layman's, view of the Bible. I think God is often more realistic about the human condition than a lot of evangelicals are. Like in the Old Testament, in the Mosaic Law, there's polygamy was allowed essentially. There's regulated polygamy. Does that mean God approves of polygamy? No, but I think what he's realizing is, in this milieu at that time, I could attempt to immanentize the eschaton and force this hyper-moralistic situation, but that might actually create more problems than it created solutions. So let's regulate some things. And I think this is how people got sideways on slavery. Same thing on slavery. I think slavery is wrong and clearly disapproved of in the Bible. it was allowed because God was condescending, just like he gave Moses. Jesus said, why did you allow divorce? The hardness of your heart. It wasn't because it was planned that way. It's not like because you have this divorce in the provision of the Mosaic law, that means divorce is this illicit, wonderful thing God approves of. So I do think this idea of we have to have a hyper-moralistic politics. If we had a hyper-moralistic politics, the Mosaic law is frankly bad in a sense because it doesn't ban all these things that we know are like sinful, like polygamy. And so that's just kind of my thing. And like, I think there is a sense, right? FDR had to ally with Stalin to defeat Hitler. And I think there is a sense in which in that sort of the domain of the magistrate or in these secular domains, it's very hard for evangelicals to not operate in a hyper-moralistic manner that like absolute purity is required in order to do anything. It's sort of like there's a Lutheran group, the Wisconsin Synod Lutherans. You don't hear much about them, but they're actually as big as the Presbyterian Church in America. And Lutherans have this theological principle that in order to have Christian fellowship, you must have agreement on doctrine. And Wells is like the hardest core on this. I don't even think they will pray together with you at grace, say grace before meals, if you are not in their particular Lutheran thing, because it's like, and I think that's kind of how evangelicals kind of operate sometimes. It's like, we can't collaborate with people. Well, that guy over there was like a bad person with some bad ideas. I can't like work on an infrastructure project for our town with him. And so I do think moralistic politics, if you will, moralistic thinking makes it hard for evangelicals to function as elite. But I don't believe that it's necessary to personally behave in an illegitimate moral manner to make it to the top in many cases.
So our opposition to Bill Clinton was a bigger problem than our opposition to Donald Trump. So what I mean by that, do you see what I'm saying by that? So we opposed Bill Clinton because he was an immoral man. But then we've been criticized, many evangelicals have been criticized for not having that same opposition to Donald Trump, whereas I would argue in some function, at least at the current moment, the opposition to Donald Trump has been misguided. Here's the guy who will actually support some of our values, not saying he's a good guy.
Well, this is what I mean by politics as a prudential domain.
Right.
So I think if you went back to 1980s America, you could say we have an expectation that our politicians behave in accordance with a certain moral standard. And of course, because there was an actual moral standard that prevailed in society. And, when you violated that, Gary Hart, his alleged affair is affair, he's out of the Senate, he's out of the presidential race. And there was a sense that you could hold people accountable, politicians accountable for their behavior in that era. I think what Clinton's situation showed is that no longer applied, that actually you weren't going to actually get in trouble. And so now we're in a world where we're in essentially a post-Christian America, where those moral standards that we might prefer in our leader are not going to be available in any candidate. And if you adopt the moralistic approach that says somebody has to be has to line up with all these moral principles, or you can't in good conscience vote for them. What you're basically saying is, I cannot participate in politics. I cannot participate in all of these things. And so I think there's an art. And that's where I feel like, guys like Paul, again, I'm very struck by Paul. I wrote down all of his commands he issued in his letter one time. And he issued a lot of commands. And I organized them into different categories. And overwhelmingly, they were sort of concerned with two things. And, I think I categorized. One was sort of personal holiness, and the other was, I call it unity in the church, I would say. And Paul issues remarkably few commands about the world outside of the church. And those that he does are sort of about how to accommodate itself to you with the least amount of trouble. So pay taxes to whom taxes are due. So far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Things like that. And even in 1 Corinthians, he's like, those who are outside, God judges. I want you to deal with the moral corruption, sexual sin inside the church. And so Paul and Jesus, neither of them were social reformers of Rome. And, not to say that we couldn't, because what happened was, as Christianity grew and grew and grew and the empire Christianized, at some point, Christians actually did have the ability to make some of these changes. Now we can start whittling away at slavery. Now we can start doing different things. And so I think, what politics is almost like, what are you able to do in certain situations? How do you advance the ball? Or do you say, how do I kind of advance the ball in this situation? Or do you say, I got to take, essentially we have to take an Anabaptist approach, withdraw into a perfectionist community in which we can fully and authentically live out, God's law in a sort of Christ against culture model out of Niebuhr. And so I think that lack of can you work in an environment, especially, and again, we're thinking about finance, or we're thinking about something else. Can we work in an environment where like you are one of a handful of evangelicals there, and you got to work with all these other people with all these other values and all these other things, and sort of like, can you be salt and light by maybe if you were able to just turn this trajectory a couple degrees, you're doing, that's as good as you can get. But maybe it's worth getting those couple degrees, because otherwise it would be even worse than it otherwise would be.
So, Aaron, what would be like some infrastructure trying to build towards this? So we're saying there are no evangelical elite. I know in your book, Life in the Negative World, you even use an example of what you said, I think mid 20th century, early to mid 20th century Catholicism is kind of a good example to look to for where kind of evangelicals are now. You said they were a sizable, diverse minority, and they really use their institutions of churches, schools, and universities, catechism classes. You even mentioned a while ago the Knights of Columbus, kind of the important role of these fraternal groups, and even their own calendar that they kind of operated by. You mentioned that there, but even in your article, you mentioned the need for patronage systems, like seeing the need to financially, and look, I hope this isn't missed in this podcast. We were still, I'd say all three of us here wanting to see people evangelize and to share the gospel, but that they're just like a lot of our patronage or our giving just typically only goes to that. And maybe infrastructure wise, we could think more about what it looks like to give in other ways. Would you want to talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah. Well, if you read Life in the Negative World, I think what you'll see, if you look at all of my recommendations, they are decidedly non-elite. Very little of them would actually advance you towards an elite. It's really more aimed at, I would call, the average evangelical, to whom, if you go to a Christian school, and if you live in a Christian ecosystem and some of these things I suggest, you're basically a little bit taking yourself out of the elite game to some extent. Okay. Now, as I said, that might be the right answer for 95 to 98% of the people. But we got to move beyond like one size fits all, answers.
Absolutely.
But helpful. If you're like, if you are someone who wants to get a good job, build a life, serve your church in a community where you grew up or whatever, probably makes a lot of sense to go to a Christian college or, to some of these things. It's like, wow, if I want to be on the Supreme Court, you better figure out how you're going to get into Harvard Law or Yale Law, and probably get into a prestigious undergrad before that, because, I think Amy Coney Barrett is like the only one that didn't go to like Harvard or Yale Law. So there are things like that you have to think about. Part of it depends on your ambition. Again, I think we need a new theology of vocation, because we don't have any way to talk about someone like actually running anything. And it's like talking to kings, one thing. What about being the king? How about that? What about being the actual president of the United States or something like that? The other one would be, again, patronage. Was a very, very long thing to be said there. The truth is, I think about this article, the Evangelical Elite article. I published it in First Things magazine.
Yeah.
Okay. Which is a Catholic magazine.
Yeah.
Basically. And I was writing it. I was thinking to myself, I was researching this for months and months and months and thinking about it. And I could have kept going for another 2 years probably before I even started writing it. I said, man, if First Things doesn't want to publish it, who would publish this? I don't think Christianity Today magazine would have published it. And I think maybe they would have, maybe I take it back. But like the reality is, right? I mean, this is one thing that I think is kind of like, kind of weird. It's like my most influential work was published with a Catholic journal. And, I don't have any like evangelical institutions that are really like beating my door down to say, Aaron, how can we help? How can we help you? How can we, what I mean, like, that's just a reality. Like in essence, I get, and I used an example in the article of a guy named Brad Littlejohn in Washington, D.C. I am convinced that a leading reason rising evangelicals who are going through the elite ranks of America often convert to Catholicism is that the Catholics actually help them along the way. And when I wrote that article, when I wrote an essay in my blog kind of talking about that point of like no patronage, I just got these emails from people like, yeah, I'm a scholar in a school and my research has been funded by 6 different Catholic groups. I haven't gotten a single dollar from any evangelical donor, even though I'm an evangelical. At some point, you're just like, maybe, it's like, what's going on here? And, so I think that's a big part. It's like crazy. I mean, I got some like, let's just say stay tuned on that one. Because I have some actual examples of where people failed to I have examples of where people failed to patronize something that they themselves said was super important to the future of evangelicalism. And I'm just like, it's kind of weird. And, so that's it. There is no, and it's not, nobody give you a job, nobody to give you money, nobody to give you a pat on the back, nobody to mentor you, nobody to give you advice. Unless you're doing like a number of predefined things. I want to be a church planner. I want to be a theologian. I want to be a missionary. I want to be a campus pastor. I want to work in Christian publishing business or something like that. If you're outside of those lanes, man, you are really on your own.
And in your paper, you talk about how that cocoons like a lot of like the evangelical, I guess people who could be taking other pathways out. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Ryan.
You're good. Let me give you the last word, Aaron. Andrew Walker pointed out quite a few years back in a work on Baptist political theology that evangelicals had been instrumental in the voting that had overturned Roe v. Wade, but they literally had no representation on the Supreme Court to actually accomplish it. And similarly, I was talking to the dean of a Christian college recently who was saying he literally can't find someone to come teach law at his school. So, but let's back up from those educational institutions. You're speaking to mostly pastors. What can we do? What can we do to, in our preaching, in our cultivation, in our encouragement, to take some first steps towards what you're describing, understanding that elites are always going to be a minority. We're probably not going to see one come out of every church, but what can we do to kind of create the culture, kind of create the soil where God might raise up those elites?
Right. That's a good question. And I really think the place to look is like vocational theology. I think the faith and work movement went from like nowhere to somewhere. Okay. And then Tim Keller with like, Center for Faith and Work in New York and Every Good Endeavor. He went from somewhere to the next place. But I still think we have further places to go. So I think we need to work, and just the way that we talk, I mean, just think about, if you're going to preach a sermon and just think about like, again, what are you sending a message for, about what it is? Like, are you basically treating vocation as essentially a venue for evangelization? Now, it may be a venue for evangelization. I'm not saying you can't evangelize your coworkers. You should if you have an opportunity. But it's like, okay, if that's how we're thinking about vocation, as opposed to thinking about, oh, maybe I should be like a federal appeals court judge, or there's like a big difference there. It's like saying I'm on the Supreme Court, and why I'm here on the Supreme Court is so that I can like have a prayer meeting with my clerks. That might be good, but like maybe thinking about the rulings, like that's, and I think some of that, and again, I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of gray area there too. But I think it is the case that like ultimately the pastor's role is, preaching the word of God. It's not, giving legal advice. That's like what lawyers do. And so I think part of the problem is that we've ended up in a situation where pastors are expected to have the answer to everything.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's like, what's our take on this? Let's go to thegospelcoalition.com and see what the official story is on this. Whereas instead of like, why don't we have lay experts who are speaking in their domain?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can like help you navigate the law as a Christian because I'm a partner in the big law firm here in town and I know how this thing works. And
Mm-hmm.
I've faced many of the same conundrums you might face. And oh, by the way, I can write recommendations for you and I can help you get this clerkship and I can do this and this and this. And, I can make introductions for you. This young guy, who's, he's at Yale and he emailed me and he's like, I'm interested in, getting an internship with like a law firm or different things. Like, what do you think? I'm like, oh, I know a firm over here. I'll put you in contact with them. Maybe something will come out of it, maybe not, but like, can I make an introduction for you? Can I do those things? And it's not the pastor's job to do that. And that's why I say the vocational theology and thinking about how we talk about vocation is really, really the main thing. And like, politics is really not the job of a pastor. The law is not the job of the pastor. Medicine's not the job of the pastor. Media is not the job of the pastor. And so I feel like that we get into a danger zone when we become overly kind of clericalist in everything that we do. So all you can kind of do, it's not your job necessarily to make people, you conjure these kind of elite positions. I do think the vocational theology and the way we talk about power, again, it's so very Anabaptist, the way people talk about things today.
Who would you recommend we talk to on those things? Who would you recommend if we were going to get someone on an interview?
Yeah,
That's a good
example.
question. I don't know. I don't think there is like a good, I think Keller's, Every Good Endeavor was like the last step of the thing, and he's obviously no longer with us. And so where do we go from here? I'm not a theologian. That's why I said somebody needs to create it, on that. I'm going to talk about, cultural and other items and things that are there, myself. But, you can think about, it's a good question. Who would we talk to? It's like, that's the thing. It's like,
have you seen David Bonson's new book?
Excuse me?
Have you seen David Bonson's new book on work?
Yeah. David, I like David a lot. It's a little, I think he's sort of more, I think he's pushing back against a certain conception of work. His book is called Full Time, I think. And he's reacting against a book called Halftime that basically says first half of your life, you do all this work and make a bunch of money. And then once you're okay, you can spend the second half of your life doing good. And he's like, no, you can like do good in your job and that. And, and so, there's good in that. And of course, he's a great wealth manager and, the Financial Times, everything. So he's sort of like in that category there in New York and California. And so, I like him. You could talk to him. I probably have my differences with him here and there, but, he knows that industry. And so within his industry, he certainly he would certainly be someone who knows a lot. And he's certainly trying to push back against the idea that like your career is sort of just a way to pay the bills kind of thing, as opposed to like a source of like mission in its own right.
Matthew, I was going to close this out. You want to say one more thing?
Yeah, I was just, for pastors listening, if this is helpful, one thing that we've done at Immanuel, every week we pray for some type of vocation in our pastoral prayer.
We do too.
And we've just tried to do that, as pastors, just to honor work and the people who we're pastoring. That's what they're doing with the majority of their lives. And I think in praying for them, really want to shape their minds to see their work as a good thing. That's something that God has created them for. And in Christ, just to do good works, for the rest of their life. And so I know it's very small, but that's one thing that we've been, so any of the pastors listening to this, I think that could be maybe a baby step there, and just trying to honor a vocation. Yep.
Right. And let me give my little nuance on that.
Do it.
Go
Which
ahead.
would be we're praying over, our research physicians who are researching, diseases that need treatments. I think the prayer is, yes, the prayer is that they'll thrive and that they'll care and they'll be humane and they'll be so. But the real prayer is that they actually cure the disease. I mean, that's the most we want them to actually be successful at eradicating a disease.
Yeah.
And that I think I want you to be the person that cures Alzheimer's. Wouldn't that be amazing? And that's kind of what it is. And now, do we have to have elites that do that? Christian, do you have to be an evangelical to cure Alzheimer's? No. So it's great if a Jewish doctor cures Alzheimer's. That's amazing. But again, when we start looking at all the different ethical issues in medicine, maybe you do want some evangelicals to be at the top of their profession and highly respected people whose word carries weight when they talk about something.
Aaron Renn, thank you so much for your time. It's been great to interview you. Thankful so much for the conversation. We look forward to being with you again next time on the Immanuel Network podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. Thank you. Thank you again.